Hi everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everybody who is here. I'm Faith Sadikon. I'm currently the program officer of Asia of Outright International. And today, just like what I said in the email, is supposedly today is supposedly the launch of our report on locating LGBTQ people in domestic violence laws in Asia. So we will right before we leave the Zoom room, I will post the link to our website where the publication can be found. But for now, since we also wanted to share this space with the activists from different countries, like representing sub-regional representing different sub-regions, then we decided to invite resource persons for this gathering. And we also wanted for this to be an intimate conversation and to take this opportunity to have discussions with activists in Asia around LGBT inclusion and domestic violence legislation. So the format of the program would be that I would share some of the findings that we have in the report, some of the recommendations that we have in the report, but I will juxtapose these findings with the questions that I will ask the resource persons for regarding certain important concepts around domestic violence, such as healing, justice, violence, victimization, and other important concepts. So for today, we have two resource persons. Actually, we were supposed to have three resource persons, but unfortunately, the resource person from India is not able to come because of a family emergency. So I'm asking. I can see that um some of the participants are from India or from South Asia. So if anyone from South Asia would like to chime in every time I ask a question, they can just raise their hand and answer whatever question they might want to answer. So yeah, hi again everyone. For those people who would like to turn on their video, you may do so. But for those who have security issues or who do not prefer for their faces to be seen in any of the recordings, you can just turn off the videos or change the names, your names, in the Zoom profile. Um, yeah, and another thing about the interpretation, we have one of our resource persons will be speaking in Bahasa, and so what we did was to find an interpreter. So every time the main resource person, Laura, will be speaking in the original audio channel. So if you want to hear the English translation, you can just press the interpretation and go to the English channel and then go back again to the main channel once Laura stops talking. So yeah, hi everyone. I am Faith. Probably since yeah, so I am Faith, and as I've said, we conducted a research and we wrote a report on locating LGBTQ people and domestic violence laws in Asia. So what we did was to map the domestic violence legislation of 10 countries. So the 10 countries are the Philippines, Timor Leste, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, China, Sri Lanka, India, and Nepal. So of course, we did this because based on our previous research, we found that family violence is a serious issue among the LGBTIQ community, and that in fact, based on the interviews that were done prior to this report, um, family violence is said to leave long-lasting impact, serious and long-lasting impact in the lives of LGBTIQ survivors of family violence. But as we all know, LGBTQ people remain invisible in basically almost all legislation on domestic violence in Asia. So of course, we did this to expose this kind of invisibility, as well as to steer the conversations around LGBT inclusion and domestic violence law. So we are thinking that this will not be the last time that we are convening for this particular issue. So just a brief background of what we found in the research that we did. We found that exclusion or invisibility in domestic violence legislation stems from many aspects or many provisions of the laws, including, of course, how the laws define survivors and perpetrators, the kind of gender framing that they adopt in their domestic violence legislation, and also in the way they frame relationships and cohabitation requirements. That's also one thing that we discussed in the report. We also discussed about certain types of how the domestic violence legislation defines or enumerates the types of violence, which usually do not include the more commonly forms of violence experienced by LGBTQ people, such as conversion practices, forced marriage, and other forms of intimate partner violence that is common among LGBTIQ partners. So we also found that although some of the legislation integrates the pertinent provisions of CEDAW and other international instruments, we found that many of the legislation puts as primordial aim or primordial goal the protection of the family, or the protection of the nuclear family, which later on we will discuss. And of course, many other things such as provisions that do not enable equitable or LGBTIQ inclusive implementation, those that refer to training, protocols, etc. So just to give also like the lens, just to also tell the folks here the lenses that we use in mapping this legislation. Of course, we in mapping the legislation, we were intentionally, we of course use the queer lens and the intersectional lens. Queer in the sense that we tried to find the heteronormative and normative framing in the laws. And we also it is also intersectional because we also tried to find the system. We also try to discuss about systems and factors that contribute to the occurrence of domestic violence, not only factors such as gender, but other intersectional marginalization and vulnerabilities. And of course, when we wrote the report, we had LGBTQ people in mind, their lived experience in terms of their interactions with legal systems, with the legal instruments. That's why in the portion of the report that talks about remedies, we talked about criminalization or the carceral forms of addressing domestic violence, as well as we pose the questions of whether these are the best strategies to adopt in our GBV work. So yeah, since I said that this is gonna be more of a space for the resource persons, and we want to juxtapose the provisions of the laws with actual experience of LGBTQ activists and survivors in terms of domestic violence. So I will be asking the resource persons about certain concepts. So right now, we have Laura as one of our resource persons, and also Justin as one of our resource persons. Justin, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about your work around gender-based violence and domestic violence?
Hi everyone, I'm Justine from China, and I'm working at Rainbow Anti-Gender-Based Violence Center in Beijing. And the center is established in 2016, and we provide direct interventions on gender-based violence, including discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And we also work to increase anti-violence awareness and capacity among community members and promote the skills of direct service providers and strengthen cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself and the work that you do around domestic violence?
Can I introduce myself in Bahasa Indonesia so Jonta can translate?
Sure. And for participants who want to hear of the English translation, just go to the English channel, then go back again to the original audio. Thank you, Laura.
Hai, oke. Hai semuanya, selamat malam dari Timor Leste. Nama saya Laura. Saya bekerja untuk sebuah organisasi yang bernama CODIVA, which is Coalition for Diversity and Action. Kami bekerja di bidang hak asasi manusia, terlebih hak-hak kaum yang tertindas seperti komunitas LGBTI, dan kami memberikan perlindungan dan juga menrefer setiap korban dari komunitas LGBTI ke partners yang bekerja sama dalam bidang gender-based violence di Timor Leste. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Laura. So for the first question, just like what I said earlier, in the 10 countries that in the legislation of the 10 countries that we mapped, we found that almost all of the legislation defines survivor and perpetrator in a gender neutral way. Only the Philippines and India define survivors and perpetrators using gender specific framing. So I'm wondering if I'm wondering about how this kind of framing or definition of gender violence actually translates in practice. How does this impact or how does this impact access of LGBTQ people to the legislation? And maybe you can talk about also other identities, not only in terms of gender, but how the definition, for instance, also frames identities in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of disability, and what are the things that you find lacking in your domestic violence legislation? Justin, would you like to start?
Yes. So for the DV laws that Chinese government has established in 2016, in the law, Article 37, it says violence inflicted between those living together who are not family members. However, in such situations as unmarried cohabitation of intimate partners, divorce yet not separated individuals, etc. So even though this was in the scope of the law, however, we have found that ministries of public securities, women's federations, and other formal supportive systems at the fundamental level are still lack of the knowledge of gender and sexual diversity. And as a result, their ability to intervene in domestic violence cases involve SOGI minorities are still very limited, whether regarding of family violence or IPV violence. So according to individuals who have seeking help from the police in such cases, the knowledge of police about SOGI minority topics and domestic violence characteristics is almost zero. So the police are incapable of identifying different types of domestic violence or the levels of severity or risks faced by SOGI minority survivors. And this directly influences their ability to provide support for SOGI minority survivors and effectively handled and punish abuser. And in some cases, the police even inflict secondary victimizations on part of the survivor.
Thank you, Justin. So in the report that we wrote, we also recommended that there has to be an actual recognition in the provisions of the law about the marginalization of LGBTQ people and the vulnerability of LGBTQ people to domestic violence. Is that something that you are also proposing to your governments and to your legislators?
Yes, we have proposed several recommendations. So the first is we should strengthen education and training for the police, as well as personnel from other government organizations involving domestic violence cases, and which will lead to comprehensive access the outcomes of past anti-domestic violence education trainings, for example, the police training. And the second recommendation is pass detailed implemented regulations for the DV law. So at the moment, we have, there are several provisions that has detailed recommendations or detailed regulations beyond the governmental law. However, it doesn't really says is applicable for the SOGI minorities. And the third recommendations is improve the anti-DV law. For example, expand the applicable scope of the DV law and expand the definition of domestic violence in the anti-DV law. And the fourth recommendation we made is increased recognition of SOGI minority survivors of domestic violence at the national level, and recognizing the violence and discrimination faced by SOGI minorities in China is a necessary step for integrating into the international community. And SOGI minority urgently need the state recognition and commitment for the protection of their rights. Yeah, that's all the recommendations we have made.
Thank you, Justin. Laura, would you like to answer the question? Laura? Laura?
Yes.
Yeah, would you like to answer my question about
Can you repeat it?
Yeah, in Timor Leste, the domestic violence legislation provides for a gender neutral definition of survivor, of victim and perpetrator. And I'm just wondering whether this actually translates to LGBT inclusion in terms of implementation. And do you have like recommendations on how we can concretize this actual, supposedly, because if we only rely on the letters of the law, supposedly LGBT people have access to the laws, but in practice, is it actually implemented that the laws are inclusive of LGBTQ people?
Yes, kita sudah merekomendasikan ke State Secretary for Gender Equality dan juga Kementerian Statistik untuk bisa membuka satu kotak agar mereka bisa menghitung komunitas LGBTI di dalam sensus penduduk Timor Leste. Dan juga kita merekomendasikan untuk SEI agar bisa mendiskusikannya dengan semua kementerian agar untuk bisa bagaimana mereka bisa mengenal lebih jauh tentang gender dan juga gender identity di Timor Leste, karena meskipun pemerintahan Timor Leste sudah mempublikasikan mengenai mereka sudah mempublikasikan mengenai politik mengenai inclusion, akan tetapi sampai sekarang implementasinya masih nol. Oleh karena itu, meskipun ada banyak teman-teman dari komunitas LGBTI yang faces to domestic violence dan juga violence yang lain, tetapi dalam perlindungan hukumnya belum terlaksana dengan baik. Tapi kita sudah merekomendasikannya ke beberapa kementerian agar bisa mengikuti pelatihan mengenai SOGI. Dengan begitu mereka bisa mengenal lebih jauh tentang gender equality, bukan hanya mengenai perempuan dan laki-laki, tetapi juga mereka juga mengenal lebih jauh tentang gender yang lain. Terima kasih.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Laura, for those insights. I'm wondering if someone from India or from India, because India and I don't want to talk for the Philippines, but I'm wondering if someone from India can talk about the definitions of survivors and perpetrators, since the law provides for a gender specific definition. If there's anyone from the participants who would like. Okay, Arushi. Okay, Arushi has bad internet, but she can write it in the chat. So while Arushi is typing her answer, I would like to share the recommendations of Outright regarding the definitions of survivor and perpetrator. Based on the interviews that we conducted, and also based on the textual analysis of the laws that we map, we are recommending that domestic violence legislation should adopt a gender neutral definition of survivors and perpetrators, but in order also to recognize the historical oppressions and the greater vulnerability of some historically oppressed sectors in society, we are recommending, and we recommended in the report, that there should be a codification of special protections given to women, LGBTQ people, girls, and other intersectional identities that relate to disability, to race, to class, and other vulnerabilities. So let's check if okay. According to Arushi, the definition of perpetrator has been expanded to include women, but the context of this legal development has been quite troubling. The domestic violence law is mostly used in the context of women being harassed by their husband and father-in-law for dowry, money, household goods, jewelry, etc. This expansive definition of perpetrator is so that the mother-in-law can be held criminally liable as well. So yeah, that's the answer of Arushi. We can now go to the second question. Just a brief background. In, like I said, in the report that we wrote, we talked about the limitations that the requirements on cohabitation and relationships, the relationship and cohabitation requirements found in the law, they limit the applicability of the domestic violence legislation to LGBTQ people. And actually it's only in Timor Leste in the Philippines that they include intimate that definition of relationship includes intimate partnerships. But in most of the laws, for instance, in Singapore, in Malaysia, they use words such as husband and wife, spouses. And in Malaysia, in fact, it is specifically stated that the law is only applicable to those who are married or those who have undergone customary marriages or recognized by the government or by the institutions. So I'm wondering how your domestic violence legislation frames relationships. Do they actually encapsulate the kind of queer kinships that we have in the LGBTQ community? And what are your recommendations in order to address this limitations in terms of defining relationships and cohabitation requirements? Justin, would you like to begin answering the question?
In our anti-DV law, it doesn't really say husband or wife. It did say husband and wife, but as I mentioned earlier, it also protects people who are living together. Yeah, so it's the same as I just said. We gave the recommendation that we should broaden the language. You should have very detailed saying people who are living together, no matter their gender identity or whatsoever. Yeah.
Thanks, Justin. I would like to read also the answer of Arushi in the chat. Arushi said that it's not so much a move to enable queer folks access to domestic violence laws, but rather allows for women to be held liable for violence against family members. There have not been documented cases of same-sex couples or trans couples using the domestic violence law yet, even though it does apply to live-in relationships and not just violence in the context of marriage. Yeah. Laura, would you like to answer the question about the relationship and cohabitation requirements? How does your law define relationships and cohabitation so that people can have access to the law whenever they are facing family violence, intimate or domestic?
Terima kasih. Di Timor Leste kita mempunyai kitab undang-undang hukum perdata. Di dalam hukum perdata itu hanya mengenal perkawinan akan terjadi antara perempuan dan laki-laki. Jadi meskipun banyak teman-teman kaum komunitas LGBTI yang mempunyai partner di Timor Leste dan mereka mendapatkan kekerasan dalam hubungan mereka, tapi mereka tidak berani melaporkannya dalam proses legalnya. Karena di Timor Leste hukum kita tidak mengenal perkawinan antara hubungan, maksud saya hubungan antara sesama jenis. Jadi di Timor Leste meskipun orang tua atau partner yang melakukan kekerasan terhadap partner dan anak-anak mereka yang mengidentifikasi diri mereka sebagai komunitas LGBTI, tapi mereka tidak berani, teman-teman dari komunitas tidak berani melaporkannya karena mereka sendiri juga menginternalize kalau kekerasan yang mereka dapatkan itu karena kesalahan mereka sendiri, karena mereka mengidentifikasikan diri mereka tidak sesuai dengan apa yang keluarga inginkan dan apa yang komunitas pada umumnya inginkan. Karena di Timor Leste mereka hanya mengenal mengenal dua jenis kelamin, yaitu perempuan dan laki-laki. Jadi hubungan antara komunitas LGBTI, maksudnya antara perempuan dan laki-laki dengan laki-laki, tidak ada yang berani melaporkannya. Dan sampai sekarang belum ada teman-teman kita yang melaporkan kasusnya ke ranah hukum. Meskipun kita sudah mencoba memberitahukan kalau mereka mau, Kodiva bisa membantu mereka untuk melaporkan kasusnya melalui jalur hukum. Tapi meskipun hari ini mereka mengatakan iya, nanti besoknya mereka kembali lagi dan mengatakan jangan diproses karena kekerasan yang saya dapatkan itu karena kesalahan saya sendiri, karena saya tidak menjadi seperti yang keluarga inginkan, atau saya tidak menjadi diri saya sendiri. Itu yang kebanyakan terjadi di Timor Leste. Jadi proses hukumnya untuk komunitas LGBTI sampai sekarang belum ada yang memprosesnya. Begitu pula dengan ofisialis yang bekerja di kejaksaan ataupun di kepolisian. Mereka juga melihat hubungan antara hubungan komunitas LGBTI seperti sesuatu yang hal yang tabu atau hal yang tidak mungkin. Jadi meskipun ada kasus seperti itu, mereka tidak berani melaporkannya. Terima kasih.
Hello. Hello, Laura.
Yes.
Hi. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Laura, for answering the
You're
question.
welcome.
Yeah, and another question that I have is that it's also based on one of the findings in our report. We found that in many of the legislation, there are in terms of how the legislation frames its aims and goals, a lot of them actually provides for family protection and protection of the nuclear family as one of the primordial goals of the legislation. And only a few laws, like the laws of the Philippines, Timor Leste, and Nepal, actually adopt the language that CEDAW provides, and the recommendations that CEDAW provides, and other international instruments. I'm wondering, because like globally, there is this global rhetoric around family protection, about protection of the nuclear family, and this kind of rhetoric is being used to by governments to pass anti-LGBT legislation and policies. So in one of our recommendations, we said that the legislation should consistently adopt the human rights framework, consistently use the human rights language, and veer away from providing stipulations that could be interpreted by implementers and by judicial bodies to mean that the primordial goal of the legislation is to protect the peace and stability of the family. So I'm wondering, especially to this is a question that is especially addressed to Justin, because we also referred to in our report, we referred to a study about China that says that the Chinese government is using some of the civil laws, some of the family laws, to actually organize people based on to organize people so that they uphold the patriarchal and anti-democratic goals of their government. So what do you think about this, Justin?
In our DV law, in Article 5, it actually says that domestic violence perpetrators against minors, the elderly, and the disabled, pregnant, and lactating women, and seriously ill patients suffering domestic violence, who accordingly to the law shall be given special protections. However, and as I mentioned earlier, although the anti-law does not covering individuals living together who are not family members, the absence of any officials or authorities guidelines such as jurisdictional interpretation clearly mentioned Soji minorities prevent police interventions. For example, when the police officers state that when it comes to gay issues, we are drawing a blank.
Thanks,
You.
Justin. Thanks, Justin. For the next question, the next question is about the carceral forms of addressing domestic violence. We actually a big portion of the report talks about remedies and the appropriate remedies that are needed by LGBTQ people. And in one of our interviews, the person that we interviewed from Sri Lanka has been consistent in saying that if you are a victim of domestic violence law in Sri Lanka, you do not involve the police, or you do not go to the police, because you expose yourself to possible persecution or prosecution. In fact, since the Sri Lankan law only punishes queer people, and they do not actually punish trans women, but trans women also do not go to the police or to institutions of the criminal justice system, because they experience re-victimization, double victimization. So my question is around remedies. And since Outright is recommending that the approach to domestic violence should be in line with human rights principles, and that it should not somehow it should veer away from legitimizing or reinforcing practices that could be against human rights principles, and that we have to have conversations around carceral forms of redress. I'm wondering how people think about it, how Justin or Laura think about it. Like, what are actually the remedies that LGBTQ people need to address domestic violence, or what do activists need in order to eradicate domestic violence? Should we focus on carceral forms of redress, or should we veer away from it and focus on like redress that revolves around provision of services, trainings, public education, etc. So yeah, that's my question. Laura, would you like to answer the question? Okay. Justin, would you like to answer the question?
I think all of above should be raised. So for our community, the most difficulty is the lack of anti-violence awareness and right awareness remain relatively low for the community. So the lack of anti-violence awareness is mainly reflected, and the difficulty of identifying hidden violence, such as mental violence and controlling behavior, and there are three main reasons why it is so difficult to identify hidden violence. So first of all, the mental violence does not usually cause visible harm as physical violence. And secondly, the power of relationship are gradually present in daily interactions, which is more difficult to be identified. And thirdly, people tend to ignore domestic conflict in their living lives and consider themselves not to be violent. And people often tend to overlook domestic conflict in their lives, thinking that they are not manifestation of violence. I think that's the groundwork for violence control of relationship. And also sexual and gender minority lack of awareness of their rights. And people involved in gender-based violence often lack awareness of their right and rarely using legal weapon to protect their legal rights. This phenomenon is rooted in the lack of understanding of the legal framework is of the existing laws, and the lack of audience of relevant legal risk. And in case of domestic violence of origin, and victims are reluctant to take their dispute to legal channel in order to maintain their relationship with their parents. And in the case of intimate partnership violence, victims are often in economic or physical disadvantaged positions and are afraid to resort their legal channels. And also the victims who are not coming out of the closet. And lastly, for victims who are not out of the closet, resulting to legal or recount would risk exposing their relatives' privacies.
Yeah. So what is your thinking, Justin? Another follow-up question. What is your thinking around revictimization and double victimization in the criminal justice systems, and how are you, what's your proposal for addressing these forms of revictimization, these cases of revictimization?
I think first of all, improve the awareness of the community and improve the language and clear identify the terms of persons who living together, and the state, the agency and department who are dealing with domestic violence have litigate and to protect sexual and gender minority groups.
In the case of China, that's also something that one of our interviewees mentioned, that well, probably based also on the culture of China, that survivors, not only LGBTIQ survivors, but survivors of domestic violence do not usually choose the path of litigation. So I'm thinking that um in situations like this, what should be the responses of the organizations working with survivors of domestic violence?
Let me think. So for us, because we provide social and legal work, so we should inhibit and the health of well-being of the Soji minority people in mainland China, and the social work should aim to enhance the existing service in ways that empower the Soji minority people. For example, this might mean expanding psychological interventions, and especially with respect to reduce risks of behavior that are linked to adverse life conditions. This may also mean that leverage the strengths of social work in family therapy to address and influence traditional family norms. Yeah.
Thank you, Justin. Laura, would you like to answer?
Sorry, Faith, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. I asked about what justice looks like for LGBTQ people, because in some of the interviews that Outright conducted, some interviewees talked about their reluctance to engage the criminal justice system, they don't want to go to the police because of the police's history of re-victimizing survivors. They also don't want to go to the police because they don't want to choose the path of or to litigate their cases, to go to courts for it. So I just want to know what your thinking is around that. Like, how are you supporting these people who do not want to go to the police? And in terms of policy recommendations, what are you recommending so that for people who do not want to go to the police or who do not want to engage the courts and the justice system and the criminal justice system, what are the assistance that we can give to them? Or what kind of framing would be fit to the context of LGBTQ survivors in your country?
Terima kasih, Faith. Pertama-tama di Timor Leste, masyarakat pada umumnya tidak mengenal, tidak mengetahui apa itu faktor yang mempengaruhi seseorang mengidentifikasikan dirinya sebagai komunitas LGBTI, dan juga masyarakat pada umumnya hanya mengenal dua jenis kelamin, yaitu perempuan dan laki-laki. Jadi oleh karena itu yang mempersulit komunitas LGBTI untuk memproses kasus apabila mereka mendapatkan kekerasan dari keluarga atau dari partnernya. Dan apa yang Kodiva lakukan sekarang, kita sudah mulai penyuluhan atau memberikan informasi kepada institusi kepemerintahan dan juga kepada komunitas LGBTI sendiri, dan untuk komunitas pada umumnya mengenai sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristic. Dengan begitu mereka mengetahui kalau hidup itu tidak hanya memandang dua jenis kelamin, yaitu perempuan dan laki-laki, tetapi juga ada gender identitas lainnya seperti komunitas LGBTI. Dan kita mengharapkan kalau masyarakat pada umumnya dan juga pemerintah Timor Leste, terlebih institusi-institusinya, kalau mereka mengetahui tentang SOGI itu sendiri, mungkin kedepannya mereka bisa memproses jika ada kasus yang melibatkan komunitas LGBTI menjadi korban dari keluarga ataupun dari partnernya sendiri. Karena untuk sekarang masyarakat hanya mengenal partner itu terdiri dari perempuan dan laki-laki, tidak ada partner yang lain. Dan juga komunitas LGBTI yang memiliki partner kebanyakannya hanya menyembunyikan hubungan itu sendiri. Mereka tidak mempublikasikannya ke masyarakat pada umumnya ataupun pada keluarga. Hanya ada beberapa orang yang mempublikasikan hubungan mereka dengan partnernya, yang saya maksudkan komunitas LGBTI, tapi selebihnya tidak. Mereka hanya menyembunyikan identitas dan juga hubungan dengan partner mereka sendiri. Terima kasih, Faith.
Thank you, Laura. So I think that's the last question that I'm gonna ask the resource persons. We are now opening the floor for the open forum. And so the participants can just throw in their questions, their comments, and the resource persons, me, and even the participants can also share their insights. So just very briefly, aside from the recommendations that I've already mentioned, Outright is also recommending that there should be a strict data firewall in reporting of domestic violence cases, because like what I said, going to the police or filing cases could expose some LGBTQ people to persecution and prosecution. And we see that this data firewall concept could help LGBTQ people to file without fearing for their lives or fearing for their security. We in the report, we also recommended that the legislation should mandate the creation of protocols that stresses the special protections that special protection should be given to women, to LGBTIQ people, and that their human rights should be able to be protected in the processes of help seeking and justice seeking. And of course, yeah, in terms of the definition of survivor and perpetrators, we are advocating for a gender neutral definition of survivors and perpetrators. But the legislation should recognize the historical oppressions and greater vulnerabilities of certain sectors such as LGBTQ people, women and girls, and other intersectional identities that relate to class, gender, and disability. So if you folks have questions or comments, just feel free to unmute yourselves and speak. Does anyone have a question or comment? Okay, so just to start the discussion, I would like to ask Justin if I mean in general, for you, what does a good domestic violence legislation look like? Or what does a domestic violence legislation, how should the domestic violence legislation be crafted so that it is responsive to the context and needs of LGBTQ people?
Yes, I think I have to think for a minute.
Sure, take your time. Laura, would you like to, while Justin is thinking, would you like to answer the question? Or anyone from the participants? I see that um some of the participants have already, like especially those from the Philippines, have already participated in some of the convening. So if people would like to um share what we have discussed, or what we are starting to do in our countries, then maybe feel free to share. Justin, are you ready?
Yes, I have a few thoughts.
Sure.
I think first of all, it has to be reinforced in the responsibilities of the Ministry of Public Securities in prevention and intervention domestic violence, and emphasize the importances of the effective of the police intervention. And secondly, strengthen the education on gender diversity and equality for all related to government representatives, including the police, women's federation, social work, and among others. And also reinforce the importance of having service providers on the front lines with knowledge about social issues and proper response mechanisms, so that LGBT community can access timely and effectively protection and access, and also increase the operational knowledge and capacity of police and other government representatives in intervening domestic violence, including how to respond to reports of domestic violence from survivors and others, and the provisions of useful resource and support, and the available and appropriate punishment and measures to be deployed against abusers, and the concrete legal and supervisory responsibilities of each agency.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Justin. Thank you. Telaga.
Hi. No, I agree. Firstly, thanks so much for organizing this. I think, just like everybody, also looking forward to the research, to the report. I think we are also currently looking at queering the Domestic Violence Act, because we also see we are also, looking at using the Domestic Violence Act to address family-related violence and abuse. Because I think even without amendments to the current Domestic Violence Act, I think there's no reason the Domestic Violence Act cannot be used as is by queer folks when they experience domestic violence, because the provisions sort of allow for that to happen. But I think the concern is, as what has been pointed out, is the lack of guidelines and the trust deficit, right? Like, folks not wanting to report, or like the lack of confidence in us, like in a context of criminalization or like state promotion of conversion practices, whether, going to the government is the best option. So I think in this context, in addition to what has already been said, I think one of the things that we observe is also maybe in some contexts, even the LGBTIQ human rights defenders or folks who are responding to cases may not necessarily look at Domestic Violence Act or the government as options, but would probably look at more community-facing options, right? So in that case, I do think there could be more capacity for like LGBTIQ human rights defenders themselves and those who are providing services. One, to expand services, and also to look at this as an option, right? And also the second thing is, I do feel that the interim protection or the protection order available in the Malaysian context is an okay redress, because it's not punitive because it's just temporary restraining order, and it allows that time for people to in some circumstances to decide what they want to do, right? And lastly, I think one of the recommendations that I would like to make is also in terms of support for establishing support services, because I think that is one of the areas where that's a bit lacking, right? Like, I think the support services in relation to LGBTIQ needs, I think it's far more underdeveloped than, support services for women and other folks. And especially for gay men, I think there is a gap because there's always lack of shelter for men and things like that. Thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Telaga. Yeah, actually, regarding the protection order, it's unfortunate that Ritu is not here, but in the during our interview, Ritu mentioned that their protection order in India is a flexible remedy, because it 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 gives the survivor or the victim the autonomy to choose what kind of remedies they want to ask from the perpetrator, or what sort of protections that they want to ask from the government. So if the survivor or the victim only wants reparation and monetary terms, then that's the only thing that the courts or the minister would adjudicate. So yeah, actually, Outright is also advocating for that, like a more comprehensive domestic violence legislation that not only, no, that is not too punitive, but it also enables participation by civil society actors, establishment of services, establishment of mental health services and health services, and public education. So is there anyone else who wants to add? Okay. So I guess if no one else would like to comment or to ask questions, I guess we can end this meeting. Since domestic violence and gender-based violence is like a staple program of Outright and the regional network on SOGI and GBV of the Asia program of Outright, we are hoping that this is only the first conversation that we would have around the topic, and we are thinking of convening more conversations about this to concretize what it actually means um to include LGBTQ people and domestic violence legislation and policies. So yeah, thank you for attending this conversation.